From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
You've heard the stories, the footprints, the shadows in the trees, the sightings whispered around campfires and buried in classified files. But what happens when science doesn't look away? This week on From the Void, we sit down with Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, professor of anatomy and anthropology, and one of the few scientists willing to seriously explore the mystery of Sasquatch. We talk evidence, biology, hoaxes, and the fine line between folklore and fact. This is part one of a special two-part conversation. Enter the forest and stay curious. All right, welcome to the podcast. I have Dr. Jeff Meldrum on with me today. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, before we get started, tell folks a little bit about your background and the work that you do.
Right. Well, I'm an anatomist/anthropologist. My principal degree is in anatomical sciences with an emphasis in physical anthropology. So it's kind of I was one of the first cohort to go through a number of new programs that sprang up in order to fill a niche, a certain need that hybridized these kind of two emphases. So I teach, it prepares me to teach in the health professions, usually in human gross anatomy. So here at ISU, I'm actually in a department of biological sciences that provides service courses for our pre-health and graduate health programs, and like occupational therapy, physical therapy, physician's assistant, radiographic sciences, and so on. But the emphasis in physical anthropology affords me the opportunity to do research in the evolution of human functional morphology. Especially, I'm interested in how we came to be walking on two legs, the timing and pattern of the emergence of those adaptations and what those distinctive adaptations are. So that's what my day job entails. Teaching in those health professions and pre-health professions programs. Occasionally, I'll be invited to teach a course in the anthro department, depending on the makeup of their faculty at the time and the need, the composition of the student body, the graduate student pool, and what coursework they need in support of their programs. And then do research which has involved everything from the analysis of fossil footprints to electromyographic analysis of muscle function, of course, geometric morphometrics of the skeletal remains, both extant and fossil remains, especially that of the lower extremity and the foot in particular. And so it kind of just really predisposed me to sort of step into the shoes vacated by, with remarkable timing, Dr. Grover Krantz, who was also a physical anthropologist and anatomist, and to concentrate on what is really the most prolific of the evidence for the existence of not only Sasquatch, but other, as we're coming to better appreciate over the decades, other potential relic hominoids like the Russian almas, the Chinese Yeren, the Himalayan Yeti, the Orang Pendek of Southeast Asia, and so forth, which are probably additional branches on a very bushy tree that represent remnant populations in various quarters of the globe. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. And your background makes you kind of uniquely suited to be researching something as mysterious as Sasquatch or Bigfoot.
Sure. Yeah. No, it really does. It's just this morning, in fact, I was corresponding with a reporter from a publication back in New York. And his questions, just the nature of his questions, the bias is so apparent, transparent, where he sees this topic as mythological. It's just a legendary entity. And so the motivation for his article, it's actually, there was some survey that was conducted that showed that the state of Washington had the most reports of Sasquatch. And so he was curious what my thoughts were as to why that was, because he was thinking of it, he says, and we'll take a deeper dive into the myth, and the cultural aspects. And I'm saying, kind of subtly said to him, well, you're kind of missing the point. The reason that there are so many reports in the Pacific Northwest is not because the people there are more prone to believe fairy tales or mythological, just so stories. It's because the ecology supports a large omnivorous primate species more aptly there in these densely populated and heavily forested and mountainous Pacific Northwest and Intermountain West to a much greater degree than the eastern states, where there's much less potential for habitat. Simply, it's purely a matter of ecology. It doesn't have to do with just what goes on upstairs. Yeah, it's an interesting. That's what I try to bring to the table is just the simple question, and I phrased it this way in my book: is there a biological species behind the legend of Sasquatch? And that's why Sasquatch legend meets science. And is there a scientific context? Is this more than just stories? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. We're still in that fringe, that limbo area in between where we don't have conclusive evidence. But boy, there's such compelling evidence. I mean, it certainly motivates my persistence at this subject. And if nothing else, just to keep the scientific door open and to encourage further documentation and verification. And we've got to turn to experimentation in order to try to assess the conclusive evidence. Short of a body, it's going to be DNA, and it's not a simple, straightforward undertaking. It's a bit complicated by the nature of the beast and its remarkable affinities. Almost certainly, its remarkable affinities to us.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive into that a little bit. And you mentioned something that I was going to bring up myself, which is that from a historical standpoint, we're not just talking about legends and lore that kind of derived from one particular geographic region. You find stories from all over the world. Now, that comes by different names, and you've mentioned a few of them. Even my native land of Scotland has the gray man.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Aware of that. Right. And it does become a little, there is overlap. I mean, if these stories were universal, and they are widespread to the point where people easily come under the misapprehension that this is just some phenomenon of the human psyche. It's just something that's universal. It's some archetype of our lost connection to the wilderness. And that's a simple, not tidy, but a simple explanation to seemingly account for this. But it falls apart under scrutiny. So like the gray man, and there's quite a trend in Britain in pursuit of Bigfoot in Britain. And there are all kinds of sightings. There's very little or no credible or compelling footprint evidence. And for me, that's the litmus test. If it is more than just stories, then it leaves footprints and it sheds hair and it voids scat and it vocalizes, does these things that primates do. But there's never been the fossil record of any kind of hominin on the British Isles is pretty meager. I mean, once because at least recently it was under ice to a large extent. But well, anyway, I don't want to go. It's kind of a path. I recently gave a talk. There's a young enthusiast, a very ambitious young man who's a real dynamo right now. And he organized an event, and I was invited to speak. And so, I took the bull by the horns and called it as I saw it. And there is no evidence. There is no compelling evidence, nor is there a basis for the existence of a population. I mean, the biggest predator in Britain is a fox. And so, it's like one real quick story. But when I was preparing this, I was kind of digging through, where is this coming from? And I looking at the different stories and so forth. And of course, Finding Bigfoot, it turns out, did one of their foreign episodes in Britain. And they sat down with Anna Nakaris, who has been a great addition sort of to the quiver, you might say. She brings some great expertise and some experience in Southeast Asia, and her open-mindedness to the possibility because of the native familiarity, it seems, with these little people, which I think are relic Australopithecines. But they asked her, if you were to go out and look for Bigfoot in Britain, where would you go? Definitely the North Woods. And so they cut to the graphic, and here's England, and the whole north of England is kind of highlighted and labeled the North Woods. So I thought, well, that seems a little bit of a stretch. And I went and I Googled the North Woods and blew it up. And just a fraction of the area they highlighted constitutes the North Woods. And then you zoom in, and 2/3 of that spot that's outlined as the North Woods is pasture land with hedgerows and stone walls. And then the rest of it, the remaining third is forest. And this is all secondary forest. It's all been logged at one point or another. Anyway, so they go out there, and the whole thing is, 10 miles by 10 miles. About 100 square miles is all. I've estimated that in North America, the expected home range for something like a Sasquatch is probably on the order of about 1,000 square miles. So 10 times that to sustain a single creature. So anyway, it was just kind of humorous. They arrive on the scene, and there was a local that was going to act as their guide, and I had to chuckle because Bobo asked, so how big is this? And he said, it's about 2 miles by 8 miles. And he said, well, what's the biggest? And that's when he asked, what's your top apex predator? Well, that would be a fox. It just, so anyway, you hate to be the one with the pin to pop the bubble, but it just, one of the challenges, one of the obligations I feel is not to pop people's bubbles, but to keep people grounded and to encourage them to ask the hard question, what's the basis? Is there really justification for something like this? Because in situations where there is no basis in biology and ecology, then you're tempted to appeal to the paranormal to justify your suppositions. And then you get these less than scientific hypotheses that don't lend themselves to any realistic objective testing, and it becomes non-scientific. And for some people, that's fine. I don't begrudge them their avocation and their enthusiasm, but not to try to dress the sheep up in wolves' clothing, I guess, or whichever way you want to go with it, with the metaphor. It just, let's be honest and objective about it.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of path that will lend credibility to something that has largely, as you said, been lumped in with the paranormal. You hear Bigfoot, and you also think about people who are into like UFOs and Mothman and all these different things that to varying degrees are, sort of incredible. And yeah, so like, let's talk about kind of connection, because we have tons of descriptions. We have some folks who have claimed to have caught or captured video or photographic evidence. And I think what you were sort of leading to is the fact that it seems to be some sort of ape sort of hybrid. And we do know things about apes, and we can say, okay, this is what apes eat. This is where apes tend to live. Mm-hmm. So that would seem to kind of help us understand where, if Bigfoot does exist, where Bigfoot might live and thrive.
Right. And keeping in mind and qualify just the one statement you made about and using the term ape, because there are people out there who get their knickers in a knot about me just simply supposedly dismissing all the human-like aspects. And what I have argued is that we can't quite distinguish on which side of that split between the hominoids, the apes, and the hominins, the human relatives and ancestors. And if it does fall on the so say Gigantopithecus turns out to be a legitimate potential candidate, someone walks out from a cave in Vietnam with a gigantic bipedal or femur of a thigh bone of a biped, an oversized biped. Hey, that's a slam dunk that, the notion of Gigantopithecus will go up several notches. If it is more closely related to us, if its form of bipedalism links it to the hominin radiation, then there are some candidates. I've repeatedly shown the remarkable parallels in craniofacial morphology and proportions between a robust Australopithecine with its extremely deep, deep jaws, very forward-jutting cheekbones and massive zygoma and, a slight expression of a sagittal crest, but not huge. More likely in Sasquatch with its greater size. I mean, it's a size-related characteristic. The bigger the chewing muscles, the mass of the chewing muscles on a cranium that hasn't kept pace proportionately, you've got to have more area for attachment. And so you have that central fin, that sagittal crest to which the muscles. But people who say, I can see the sagittal crest, what they really mean to be saying is there appears to be a sloping of the forehead or the top of the head, because you don't see a crest sticking up. That crest is completely encompassed by muscle and then connective tissue on top. A gorilla even has a kind of a thick pad of connective tissue that rests on top in addition to the bulging temporalis muscle. So the point being that there are alternate possibilities. Now, I draw the line at Homo. There is no evidence to suggest these creatures are akin to something like a Homo erectus, or definitely not a Neanderthal, both of which were quite sophisticated, had extensive material culture, as well as complex social system and home bases and fire control and the tools and accoutrements of a much more human-like. My opinion, my conclusion, drawn from lots of observation, I shouldn't use the word opinion because it's a conclusion drawn on the basis of lots of observation, is there is no basis to say that they are forest people, unless you want to use the word people in a very generic sense or metaphorical sense, like a Native American might refer to the bear as folk or people. They are the people, as is the case with so many Native American designations for themselves. They are the people. Now, whether that is an egotistical, egocentric elevation of them above everyone else, or I've often wondered if they have recognized that there are other creatures that are kind of humanoid, but they're not the people. We are the people. They are something else. They are the the Puquas, the Omas, the whatever, the hairy men, whatever anglicized version. Kind of an interesting, and I've actually asked some Native Americans, and they can't really answer that. I mean, so much of their tradition, even their self-identity, is kind of lost in the mist of time. It's not to be unexpected. So now back to your one other caveat to make is whether we're talking about hominins, which these early hominins are basically bipedal apes anyway, or some other form of ape like a Gigantopithecus. As we make comparisons to the living apes, you have to recognize that the living apes are themselves these relic populations. They're on the verge of extinction. They're rare and endangered for the most part. I mean, there have been some interesting discoveries that suggest that in some areas their numbers are stronger than we thought. But compared to the diversity of morphology, of ecology, locomotor adaptation that is represented in the Miocene period, I mean, we now know it's just grown and grown in leaps and bounds over the past several decades of my career. We now know of nearly 100 extinct species of ape. And today we've got, depending on how you split hairs or slice the pie, at least 3 or 4. Mountain gorilla, lowland gorilla, a couple species of orang, and several subspecies. Well, the bonobo. And so we could squeeze out maybe 5. The point is, they are all relic populations in tropical refugia, and they don't represent the diversity. So in making comparisons and trying to draw inferences to bracket or to characterize what Sasquatch, I draw upon that information, but I always with the caution that there could be exceptions. You can't limit yourself just to what? This is what one of my colleagues on a documentary, she was shown to say, she walks out into San Francisco Park and she goes, look around. Look around. It's a veritable desert. I mean, here in a temperate rainforest, essentially, it's a veritable desert for apes. Apes have relatively large brains and need a very rich diet for the growth and development of their offspring and their sustenance. And that's why they're limited to the tropics. Well, first of all, that's just completely hogwash. There are all kinds of other sources of food. For example, in the colder latitudes, there are salmonids, and fish oil is an excellent brain food. And isn't it interesting? We have all these anecdotes of Sasquatch fishing, reaching under the bank to pull fish out, or stealing fish from the weirs and the drying racks and smokehouses of the Native Americans. There are lots of anecdotes from tribal peoples that when the salmon are running, the Sasquatch appear more frequently along the banks and rivers of the streams of the Pacific Northwest. And isn't it interesting? I didn't even know this until I started studying into some of these ecological parameters. But, I asked myself, I don't know, are there salmon runs in Asia? Well, yes, the whole circum-Pacific coastline has salmon runs, salmon spawning. And so you can imagine then a Gigantopithecus or even a hominin species like a robust Australopithecine that had gotten gigantic had began to exploit. And I think that gigantism is the key to their exploitation of more northerly latitudes. That's where the Pleistocene megafauna evolved, was in the northern colder zones. That's why everything is covered in hair, the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, and so forth. But as they exploited those habitats, then a potential resource that they would encounter would be salmon. And seasonal, yes, but they have quite staggered runs and present a very realistic food resource and the point is that critical need for calories really doesn't kick in until the brain is relatively as big as you find in Homo and up. That's when that's when the transition to meat was so critical in human evolution as part of the diet. So if you're down in the brain size of early hominins, like Paranthropus had a brain that was maybe 10% bigger than a gorilla or chimp. If you look at Patty, back there behind me, if we can take her as representative, she has the brain relative to body mass that's on par with that of a great ape or an early hominin. And so that critical need for a minimum amount of calories in order to sustain a big brain isn't there yet. I mean, in the apes, it's not as pressing an issue as this one colleague of mine would have you believe. So anyway, sorry, this is
No, that's
kind of like lighten the fire or the firework and no tail on it. Just goes all over.
No, I think that's really helpful information because, like we were starting to talk about, we look at more serious research into the potential existence of an animal such as Bigfoot. This helps sort of narrow down where what might look. And
yes.
So not only would we look for deeply forested areas where one could survive, but also mentioning the food supply and what the food they might need. Talk about, that's probably a good transition into talking a little bit about, you mentioned evidence, and I know people are probably like, okay, so what evidence is there? Because we haven't found a full body or a skeleton yet. And so what do we have? Like, what evidence has been presented that in your eyes is interesting?
Well, for me personally, and given my research interests and expertise and experience, it was the footprints that drew me in as an academic. I mean, I wouldn't have felt really justified to carve out a portion of my research program to address this if that weren't the case, if I didn't see it dovetail so nicely with what I was already doing. And so the accumulated footprint evidence, the event that really sort of invigorated my motivation, my curiosity, was the opportunity to examine a long line of 14 to 15-inch footprints in southeastern Washington. And these were so fresh and so clear, there was no ambiguity. They either had to have been hoaxed or they were the real deal. There was, they weren't bare, they weren't ambiguous potholes, mud puddles. And, again, given my expertise, I'm quite confident in my assessment that these were the real deal. I mean, there was skin ridge detail. They were so fresh. The substrate, the soil was so fine. It's in a region there of southeastern Washington, much like here in southern Idaho, where we have a prevalence in the soils of this glacial loess, this fine talcum powdery soil. And when it's wet, it's quite clayey, and it transfers remarkable detail from the skin surface. And so you can still see it was drizzly weather. It was overcast and kind of drizzly. And under those conditions, kind of details get washed out or literally pulled out by gravity because of the softness, the moistness of the soil. But it was that. I cast a series of 7, just trying to select examples that showed the variety of expression of morphology and dynamics. Now I have over 300 footprint casts and hundreds of files with hundreds of photographs of other supposed or would-be footprints. And I'm confident I should put it this way. Of those that have kind of made the cut, I'm quite confident in them that there's a lot of stuff that comes to my attention on an almost daily basis, if not weekly, definitely, of people sharing their finds with me. And I must admit, there's a lot of chaff. I'm glad for the privilege of having a look and making some assessment or help guiding an assessment. But people are eager and oftentimes see more than is actually there. But every once in a while you get that gem, and that's what really kind of keeps it going, keeps the wind in the sails, is you see these just remarkable examples. And it's like, yeah, something is leaving these footprints. You look at the writings of some of the movers and shakers from academia, like Krantz, like Sanderson, like John Napier, that I hold in high regard as a scholar in the area of human paleontology and especially locomotor adaptation. He was a physician and anatomist as well. And that was the take-home message. That was the bottom line of his book, is he was convinced that Sasquatch exists. He said, because after all, something is making those footprints. Now, he was a little confused and I think it was about the footprints, the nature of the footprints, because I think he was working with a very limited sampling. He overinterpreted some of the distinctions, and without taking into account, in part, the distinctions of the substrate in which the footprints were documented, which can really influence the appearance and the dynamic aspects of the step. So he had parsed out what appeared to be 2 different types of footprint, the hourglass and the human type, and really kind of muddled and clouded the water, unfortunately. But I think I've pretty much straightened that out and pointed out where he got down the wrong path and marshaled many more examples to show the continuum of expression that he had partitioned into 2 bins. But the point is, something is making those footprints. So you add to that hair that can't be attributed to any form of wildlife. Others with expertise that are examining the vocalizations. And again, you've got these recordings that can't immediately, if it was just a coyote, when it is just a coyote, you can readily line it up and see the formant frequencies and the very distinctive characteristics of the quantified sonogram. And it's very easy. The fingerprint of, figuratively, the sonograph is distinct. So what do you do if you've got something that doesn't match anything else and doesn't seem to be something readily imitatable? Yeah, so it just keeps accumulating.
That's just the beginning. In part 2, Dr. Meldrum dives even deeper into the physical evidence that can't be ignored, the peer reactions he's faced, and what he believes might be hiding in the wilderness. The search isn't over. The evidence is mounting. And next week, the hunt continues. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next.